Greetings, and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tal. You can also find me on Facebook in the Sorcerer's Guild. Today on Magical Theory, we are going to be talking about honor and reputation, and how they can increase the power of your spellcraft. Okay, so in the previous video on time, I broke the video up into segments, and I felt like that was a really good format, so we're going to go ahead and do that again this time. So first, I'm going to define the words honor and reputation in the way that they relate to spellcraft, and then we're going to discuss how we can use these concepts to increase the power of our spellcraft, and then we're going to discuss some potential problems that can arise if you don't properly resonate with the personal code that you have chosen. And then I'll do a bit of a recap to make sure that I make all those concepts clear, and then after that we'll just do the regular outro that we always do. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and get into it. So the first one we're going to be talking about is honor. Now, I'm not talking about the old school knights in armor, chivalry of Charlemagne version of honor, nor am I talking about the more recent tip your hat, fedora wearing type of honor. The word, frankly, has been dragged through the mud a lot recently. And like a lot of things, those who speak a lot about honor often don't know much about it. But we are talking about honor in the form of a personal code. And in order for this to be useful to the sorcerer, it must be a personally chosen code that resonates with the personal integrity of who you are. Yeah? And we'll get more into the importance of why that's important in just a moment. But first, let's go ahead and define the word reputation next. Okay, on the surface, of course, the word reputation means what other people think about you, or the history, or the known history of what you have done. Now, when we're talking about it in relation to spellcraft, it goes a bit deeper than that. Because when we're dealing with spirits or other magical beings, or even other people that have intuitive abilities, they can often sense some about your history. And this is created through repeated actions. Obviously, that's how your history is created. But also, these repeated actions create a resonance within the self. And spirits can sense this, as well as sometimes literally sense your literal history, the things that you have done. So when we're talking about reputation in this sense, it is in a deeper meaning of the word beyond just what you're publicly known to have done or said to have done. Because with that public reputation, right, sometimes we get reputations we don't deserve. And we're not talking about that necessarily. We are talking also about the deeper aspects of this concept, as in the narrative of who you are and what you have done. Okay, so now that we have defined those terms, let's go ahead and talk about how they can benefit you and how you can increase the power of your spellcraft through your personal code. Okay, so as I said, this has to be something that you have chosen personally from yourself, and it has to come from within you. And just examining yourself to create this code in and of itself is a powerful part of this process, because what we're doing here is creating cohesion of the self. Like I'm always talking about, cohesion of the astral form, cohesion of the self. We want to create an actual structure to who we are as a person. And in order to do that, we need to look within ourselves and find those concepts that resonate with us. This can't be some outside adopted ideas. Doesn't mean that you can't take some ideas from other areas and adopt them into your personal code, but they need to be things that resonate with you, because this is part of defining yourself as a person. And we can even link our personal sigil to this. When we draw our personal sigil, we should be putting our code into it. Or if we already have our personal sigil, and this is the first you've heard about this idea, because that is the manner in which I've brought them up to you, then the next time that you're drawing your personal sigil, after you have your code, after you have come up with a personal code, you want to keep it in mind as you draw your personal sigil and draw it in celebration of the creation of that code to have that link. And this actually gives more strength, more cohesion to the personal sigil and links it more deeply to you. But also, once you have this full understanding of the self, well, let's get to that in a moment. First, let's continue on with this understanding of the self. And the next part of this is that as we design this personal code, it doesn't have to be, it is what resonates with us, but it doesn't have to be who we are as a person right now. It's who we desire to become. So with the adoption of a personal code, this is also another area where we are able to transform the self into the desired self. And the more we act within this personal code through repeated action, the more it becomes the who we are now. Yeah? So this personal code is a way of personal growth and creation, not just definition of the self. Well, it is definition of the self, yeah, but we're adding to that definition. Okay, and once we have fully understand who we are through this personal code, that gives us a context to see our thread within the weave of the pattern more fully, because we have been more fully defined as to who we are. And once we have defined who we are, this adds to our narrative, and we'll speak more about narrative with the reputation part. But as we become cohesive in who we are and begin developing this narrative, the narrative itself becomes more cohesive, and this even helps us in remembering past lives. If we've had this code before, once we start developing it again, it'll start clicking. But if this is the first time that we have a code, then going forward, this actually will help us remember this life once we're in the next one, if we resonate strongly with this code and adhere to it. Okay, so this also gives us a momentum to our spells, because it gives us that strong link to the personal sigil and to our sense of self. And then along with this concept of honor and this personal code, which I'm not going to say a lot about what your personal code should be. Mine is based a lot on the idea of the law of reciprocity, which, if you haven't heard me talk about it before, the law of reciprocity states, treat those who act kindly with kindness, but to those who behave cruelly to yourself or others, you do not owe them kindness, and may repay your debt if it becomes necessary. And my personal code is based a lot off of that concept there. The personal code, I would recommend it as something flexible, because as we're going to get to, if you don't resonate with your personal code, it can cause issues. And if you are constantly acting outside of that personal code, that erodes its value, and you're going to need to adjust your personal code if you can't keep up with what it was you wanted it to be. So we want to adhere to that personal code as much as possible, and that gives us forward push. It actually increases our will, because it gives us a greater understanding and sense of self. Yeah? Okay, so let's see. What have I covered so far in that? We've covered the idea of linking it to the personal sigil and how it defines the self, and how it actually aids in essentially our immortality, because once we have defined ourselves with a personal code that resonates, this is one of the things that carries easily into the next life, because it adds to the actual story of who you are. Okay, so beyond that, we have a related concept to this. Oh, okay, before we get to that, there's, like I said, this helps us create who we are. So with this personal integrity, we are then able to integrate the self that we want to be into the self that we are now, and find our thread within the weave of the pattern and give us context to where we are within the weave. And once we see our context within the weave of the patterns of fate around us, we are more easily to affect that pattern and weave our own desires into the threads of our fate. And that gives us more power to that spell work, of course, because we're able to see the context and the complexity more clearly of what it is that we're doing once we have fully defined who we are within that tapestry. Okay, so now that I have all that out of the way, we're now going to talk about one's word and the power of one's word. Now, of course, this is beginning to verge on reputation, because on the first level of this, it's pretty obvious that the more you break your word, the less value it has. But if you look deeper into that, there is more truth in it than we think about. This means the more you lie, the more you speak things that do not come true, the less power there is in your words. And this will literally weaken your statement of intent. So the more you hold to your word, the more integrity you have in the way that you speak and what you say, the more power, the more power there will be in your statements of intent, because of the momentum of what you saying being true carries over to what you say becoming true. So there is a lot of importance in keeping your word and keeping the honesty of your speech. Now, of course, I'm not saying don't ever lie. Sometimes deception is required. Yeah? And so that we need to find a way within your personal code to deal with all the gray areas of life. Because I understand that life is not simply black and white, and your code should reflect that. Certainly my code does. It has to be, I recommend it being flexible in some areas, but also being rigid enough to keep you, well, to keep you defined as yourself, and just to keep you from doing things that parts of you would find immoral. Here's a big part of what you're looking for there is, what kind of things do you want to be in your story? Yeah? What kind of character do you want to be in the story of your life? And that's how you should create your personal code. Anyways, back to this idea of the word. So, the better your word is kept, the more powerful your words are. And the more trusted your words are, of course. And that doesn't just affect people in general, or people in the spiritual community or magical community. It also is important with spirits. You need to keep your word with spirits, and that begins us more into this idea of reputation. Now, before we get all the way into reputation, I want to talk about assuming roles, because this is somewhere in between. Because roles, it's important that the role's reputation be maintained. Yeah? And when you are assuming a role, this is something beyond a personal code. This is, you are agreeing to adhere to the codes of that role. So it is important for you to understand the community that you are interacting with, and what that role is expected to be, and that you are able to resonate with this concept when you take it on, whether it be an admin of a Facebook group, or if you're agreeing to become a priest for a particular spirit. You want to understand what that role is, and the more you step away from that role, the less valuable that role becomes. The less it becomes the role. Every time you step out, every time you act outside of the code of that role, or the expected actions of that role, it denigrates the role itself. So you want to adhere to the codes that you have agreed to, because that will strengthen the powers granted in that role in whatever fashion you are working. Okay, so now, how does reputation affect spellcraft? Well, this one, obviously, if you have a reputation in the community, for being someone that can be trusted. People are much more likely to work with you in joint ventures. You know, people are much more likely to charge a sigil for you if you have a reputation as being someone that doesn't put out sigils that might harm other people, and sigils that if people charge them, maybe even that will benefit them in some way. They're much more likely to charge your sigils, obviously. But there is also that idea I spoke earlier about your story, your history. And when you are working with spirits, they can sense that. And they also tend to know about things you've worked with other spirits. And so you want to establish a good working relationship with the spirits so that other spirits know that that is how you work. In fact, I already have a video on this. I'm going to put a link to that here. And that video talks a lot about reputation with the spirits and how, as you treat the spirits, they're going to treat you, because a lot of them believe in that law of reciprocity as well, and they're going to treat you how you treat them. Yeah? I mean, that's a pretty good rule of thumb for anybody, in my opinion. But it is very much the way with spirits. If you have a reputation for bossing spirits around, bringing them into circles and forcing them to do your bidding, then after a while you won't be able to trust spirits, because they're all going to think of you as behaving in that manner, and that's your reputation. On the flip side, if you work with spirits and treat them friendly and kindly, establish a rapport with them, that reputation gets around, and pretty soon you won't really even need a circle of protection as much when you're summoning spirits. So now that we've covered how to use a personal code to add extra emphasis to your spells, and how to use it to even create a more cohesive self, which one then can even help carry you into the next life, and how reputation can help you in your work with spirits, let's talk about how, if that personal code doesn't resonate with you properly, what problems can arise. Well, first amongst these problems, of course, is if you take a lot of actions or cast a lot of spells that don't resonate with what you've chosen as your personal code, then it's going to break apart at your sense of self and can actually do more damage to your astral form than if you hadn't chose a personal code. So, if you find yourself taking a lot of actions that don't coincide with the code that you have chosen, you may need to realign your code. And so that's why when you choose a personal code, you need to pick one that is actually in alignment with who you are. That is not to say that we cannot use the personal code to create ourselves, like I discussed earlier, but it needs to be ideas that truly resonate. This isn't a way to create yourself into something totally different from who you really are. This needs to be things that you actually can keep to. Yeah? Okay, so keep that code something that is you can keep within your own personal integrity, and the same with the idea of keeping your word. Don't give your word if you don't know that you can't keep it. Don't make promises you can't keep. Yeah, that's my advice there. And well, with that, with the word part, there's not much more that can be said there. The more that you break your word, the less power your word is going to have. And that's all the potential problems are there. So back to the personal code bit. There is a bit more going on there. Yeah, when you are acting within your personal code, it is very important that you focus on the actions of your personal code, and the actions, repetitive actions, that get you a good reputation, rather than focusing on the image of being honorable or having a good reputation. Whether this is something that you're focusing on the image in yourself, or focusing on creating that image out to other people. And this isn't just for more moral reasons. There are very self-interested reasons why these are bad. Yeah? And let's talk about that first one of creating an image to the self within the personal code. And the reason for this is if you're using that personal code, personal sigil, all these things as something to create an image for yourself, then every time you cast a spell, the intent of the spell, part of it will be on the intent, but part of your mind is going to be focused on creating that image. And then what you essentially begin doing is casting a spell of illusion on yourself to feel more like this self that you've tried to create. Yeah? And this becomes stronger over time, and the more that it's fed into this illusion or delusion of the self in this image, the more it feeds into, the more it will pull away from your spells, until eventually, whenever you cast, all you're doing is feeding into this delusion. And your spells don't even begin to manifest anymore. Begin to stop manifesting. So, we don't want to allow this concept of a personal code and honor to inflate the ego. This is not something to create an image. This is not something to make oneself feel cool. This is something to create a proper understanding and structure to the self. And that can only be done through the actions of adhering to the personal code. And when we adhere to the actions of your personal code, this is also what creates a good reputation, by always acting consistently within your own character. And of course, if we act outside of our character, that is how we damage our reputation. And when we damage our reputation, this can affect how spirits react to us. This can affect how people react to us, and people might stop charging our sigils for us or working with us in groups. And even if we're a solitary practitioner that never asks anyone to charge our sigils, it is still nice to have that sense of community. And so that's where reputation comes in on a mundane level as well, because it is nice to have other people with the community that we can talk to and that will exchange information with us freely rather than disliking us, yeah? But we're getting a little bit out of the scope of what the video is actually supposed to be about, I suppose. Okay, so now I promised a bit of a recap, so we'll go over that. So we talked in this video about how honor can help you create a more cohesive sense of self and a more cohesive spiritual form, and this helps you create context for yourself within your fate and your weave within the pattern, which allows you to not only add extra understanding and strength to the power of your spells, but allows you to actually carry that on into the next life. And if we link this concept into our personal sigil, it creates a much more powerful link to our personal sigil, which, as you may know from the previous videos on personal sigils, we can use for many purposes, including remote viewing locations and astrally traveling to locations. And that's one of the areas where this helps with the personal sigil a lot, because it creates a more cohesive link to that sigil. That sigil is more part of you the more you understand yourself. Okay, so then we talked about reputation and how having a good reputation in the community will help you with other people helping you with your spell work and doing joint spell work. But also we talked about how it will affect how spirits react to you and which spirits are willing to work with you. We talked about how to maintain that reputation as well. And we talked about some of the things that can come into conflict with you if you don't properly resonate with your personal code, or if you become too proud of the idea of your personal code and allow delusion to inflate your ego. And if you if you focus more on the image of the personal code rather than the actions. Okay. So, I believe that brings us up to speed for this episode. Thank you once again for joining us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. Until next time, bright blessings and an interesting fate. This has been Sorcerer Tal.